Institute. Well, let's now speak to Labour's Chris Leslie, their Shadow Chancellor, who's previously headed up a campaign for more devolution of powers to town halls. And just looking at your Labour Party manifesto before the election, Mr Leslie, you say we will embark on the biggest devolution of power to our English city and county regions in 100 years, transferring £30 billion of funding. So presumably you must be backing George Osborne's campaign.
Oh, and if there is genuine devolution, of support it. It's got to, though, we've got to make sure it's something that is comprehensive across all parts of the country, and that includes not just England, but Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. I think a lot of local authorities will be slightly worried that there is a bit of a piecemeal approach here that doesn't necessarily include all the regions and counties. But if it's genuine devolution, everybody is in support of that, and we want it. The problem is that a lot of local authorities have heard these warm words from the Chancellor many times before over recent years, and they'll be worried about whether actually this is masking a wider agenda. There's no further certainty today about the looming funding decisions, which of course the election haven't changed, that are coming towards local services, and they know in the past that local services have been hit and the pace of those reductions are due to increase very significantly. So I think it's time now that the Chancellor explained who is going to be harmed by some of those decisions and what is the extent of them.
Well, they have been very clear about what the situation is going to be in Manchester, haven't they? I just read out the numbers. The amount that's going to be spent on policing, the amount that's going to be spent on housing, the amount on transport. All of these decisions have been spelled out in pounds and pence, and that's how much the local mayor will have to deal with.
Well, of course, that's the current budget settlement, but of course there is imminent decisions on funding that are coming down the road, and we need to know what are the implications for local communities. It's not just Labour authorities that are concerned about this. Political local authorities from all across the spectrum know that sometimes when they hear the Chancellor talking about devolution, actually perhaps it is masking a wider agenda, and we just want to know whether this is genuine devolution, which of course we support, or whether this is a vehicle for something else.
Well, let's keep you there, Chris Leslie, and let's bring in Professor Tony Travers from the Department of Government at the London School of Economics. Professor Travers, what do you think the agenda is behind this?
Well, it's partly a devolutionary agenda born of the fact that the UK is very centralised and England is very centralised within the UK. It's partly, of course, political. George Osborne is a politician, and he understands the Conservative Party needs to extend its reach into the north of England, not only be a party of the south and certainly the urban north. But I think the other thing to bear in mind is, of course, Scotland and Wales, but particularly Scotland. Devolution to Scotland is undoubtedly going to beg questions about, well, what for England, and city regional devolution would offer a partial answer to that question too.
That's a fair point, isn't it, Chris Leslie? The phrase Northern Powerhouse was coined by the Conservatives during the campaign. You did win in a lot of traditionally Labour seats in the north, but UKIP came second to you. This is the area that the Conservatives want to focus on for the next election campaign, isn't it? And this is the start of that campaign.
And we know, of course, that this is a thoroughly political Chancellor. They did win the election, and of course they have the mandate for their manifesto. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to be a strong opposition and provide challenge and scrutiny to, first of all, whether this is genuine devolution, or in fact, if this is a wider agenda to mask some very deep reductions in funding for local authorities. And I'm not going to let George Osborne get away without now explaining how he fills that black hole, both of the cuts that were set out but not explained before the election, and of course all of those spending pledges that were made but had no substance behind them about how they were going to be paid for. So that, I think, is very much part of this equation as well, because as Tony will readily admit, local authorities do still depend very much on central government support to have fair approaches to funding, particularly for less well-off communities.
Professor Travers, does regional devolution, does it work in economic terms if we look at it in other countries? And also, if it works, does that therefore mean that the actual economic power of the capital is diminished, or does it bring the whole country with it?
Well, there's no doubt that Britain is one of the most centralised countries in the world, and England within it. Separately, Wales and Scotland are pretty centralised, actually, but England is very centralised. So compared with other countries, Germany, France, Spain, America, no doubt that there's far more power outside the centre. Now, the question of what would happen if this policy really gets going, of course, there is no limit to how far it could be taken. And of course, there is this short-term question that Chris Leslie pointed to, that of course local government will have to make big cuts, there's no question about that, to make the books balance. And therefore, if more powers are devolved to local government, it would make it easier to do that with bigger pooled budgets, greater opportunities for efficiencies. And I think all of this does pose a challenge for the Labour Party, actually, which is how far is it prepared to grasp the devolutionary ideal which many of its leaders in northern and Midland cities actually want. So there's a big challenge for Labour there too.
Let's put that to Chris Leslie. Did you find when you were out on the doorsteps in the north during this election campaign that this was something that voters in the north really cared about? Do they really want it?
I think a lot of local communities do want real, genuine devolution. They don't want all of their decisions being made in Whitehall. But we've been hearing these words from the Chancellor many, many times over recent years, and it shouldn't just be a sort of political device here. It's got to be genuinely involving everybody, not a piecemeal approach to one part of the country excluding others, but that includes everybody, not just one region but all regions, and also counties as well that have to be included in this. And I'm worried that we're not taking a thought-through UK-wide approach here. And it's also perhaps masking a deeper agenda when it comes to this sort of shift from George Osborne as he goes into his funding set of decisions for local services, because those communities, particularly in the north, have been very, very hard hit before, and they really haven't seen anything yet.
OK, before we let you go, Chris Leslie, I just want to ask you a quick question about Labour leadership. You're Shadow Chancellor, it's a big job. Over the next few months, your party is going to decide on a new leader. Which direction should your party be going? Should it be moving more to the left or should it be moving more to the right?
Well, I've said already in the recent days that I believe we've got to now listen very carefully to particularly those voters in England, my constituency in Nottingham, who obviously felt that when it came to it they wanted to support the Labour Party but just didn't feel that they could do so. So I think we've got to listen to those lessons, make sure we reflect on that in our policy review process, and we'll be doing that. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that we are a strong opposition, scrutinising absolutely everything that David Cameron and George Osborne are doing, because I think that is what the country want and deserve, a strong opposition. And of course we want to then create a trusted alternative to this Conservative government.
That wasn't really answering the question, though, was it? You've been talking to those voters, you were campaigning with them. What was the message from those voters? Do they want the party to be more left, more right?
Well, I think they had their hesitancy and their fears about the Labour Party. I think that the government's attempt to whip up sort of Nicola Sturgeon SNP fears played into that. I think we need to address those anxieties that people have and make sure that we create that trusted alternative. And that process starts now. But I'm not going to just let George Osborne and David Cameron get away with their first 100 days, because communities across the country are going to be really affected by their decisions. The election actually hasn't changed that. Their plans, I think, are still very unexplained, and now is for them to set out who's going to be paying the price for some of their decisions, particularly when it comes to the taxation and spending agenda.
Sorry to interrupt, Ms Leslie. You're just not answering the question, though, and this is what voters hate, isn't it? They just want a straight answer to the question. You're the Shadow Chancellor. The Labour Party is in a difficult position. You're deciding on a new leader. Do you think the party should move more to the left or should it move to the right? It's a valid question.
I've already said many times I believe that the centre ground of British politics is absolutely where the Labour Party needs to be. And I'm also very...
It is, because that hasn't worked for you in the election, has it?
Well, I think that is exactly the debate that we have to have. But I fear also that George Osborne is now, with with David Cameron, going to now start gradually to lurch more to the right, particularly now that they have an overall majority. There's no sense that they are necessarily having to make decisions in the centre ground, and I think we've got to watch very carefully that agenda. There's a lot that's unexplained, and I think people may not realise what is to come, but we're going to watch it and we're going to scrutinise it and we're going to call them out on it.
We'll leave the viewers to decide whether you've answered that or not. What about a candidate? Have you decided who you will be backing?
I'm not thinking about the leadership election today. I'm thinking about making sure I scrutinise exactly what the Chancellor of the Exchequer is proposing today. If it's genuine devolution, we welcome it, but I suspect that there's a hidden agenda here as well.
OK, Chris Leslie, thanks very much for joining us. Shadow Chancellor and Professor Tony Travers, thanks very much for waiting there.
Now, Prince Harry has been learning more about